Ladies and gentlemen of the Glass Room, we're starting our event with Renee DiResta and Matt Mitchell upstairs in the event space in about 2 minutes. So please join us upstairs in the event space for the event on pushing back on misinformation. Thank you. Hello. Hi. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Glassroom Events program, which is hosted by Tactical Tech in collaboration with Firefox. You'll see events taking place here almost every day, so check the website. We're adding events every day, so keep on checking. Please come back for more. These talks and discussions here are a chance to delve deeper into some of the issues that are raised by the exhibits at the Glassroom, and also to bring your voice into the conversation. So after today's discussion, there'll be a chance for you to ask questions. We are live streaming today, so please check your phones and silence them. Tonight, I can't think of two better people to talk about our topic, which is misinformation and how it spreads everywhere from our inboxes to ballot boxes, and how it's influencing everything from local neighborhoods to national elections. We're happy to welcome tonight Matt Mitchell, who's my colleague at Tactical Tech. Matt's our Director of Digital Security and Privacy, but he also wears many other hats as a security researcher and a security trainer, a Mozilla Fellow, and as the founder of Crypto Harlem, which teaches cryptography tools to communities in Upper Manhattan. Matt is joined tonight by Renee DiResta. Renee is also a Mozilla Fellow and an expert in the spread of disinformation and misinformation across social media. She's written about and researched everything from the spread of Russian propaganda to conspiracy theories to Amazon's algorithms. And she's advised Congress on foreign interference in political campaigns. And she's the author of the hardware startup, Building Your Product, Business, and Brand. So please join me in welcoming Matt Mitchell and Renee DiResta.
Do you have a preference?
Yeah. Hey,
All right.
everybody. So we just jump right in?
Let's do it.
All right, great. So thanks for coming. I'm Matt Mitchell. I'm not Renee. And on this topic on misinformation, fake news, and more specifically the targeting of African Americans, black communities inside the United States, some of us were made aware of this from reporting in 2017, but this is an issue that has a history that goes as far back as the civil rights era and even pre-civil rights era. There was a report that was written in 1963 that's in the John F. Kennedy Library and Museum. And in it, it's like a security report that's now declassified, and you can find it. And it's on a member of our government who was monitoring Soviet communications and coverage of civil rights issues inside the United States. And in that, they found that looking at the strings on a sweater, let's say, of the United States, the areas where the United States has divisions or fault lines, as the West Coast earthquake city will know, right? One of the biggest ones is the way that people in the United States have been treated, specifically marginalized communities, and including black communities. And in the report, it found that all this discord, violence in the streets, Jim Crow laws, all of these things were being reported to Asia, Africa, South America, and they were saying, look at how they treat black people in this country. That's how the United States treats all people of color in the world, right? And there's a tactic when it comes to a lot of Soviet press communications of that time, which was saying, if the United States is so great, right, what about these issues? And that's a tactic that continues to be used. It's kind of like this whataboutism. And you'll see it in things that are close to state or state-sponsored news to this day, where they'll say, hey, on RT, what about this or what about that? And it has a twofold effect. On one side, you have people who are living inside now Russia, right? Who maybe there's protests, which, like you'll see in the news recently, over different things, different issues. But they say, look, we're not perfect. But if you think the US is so great, what about their treatment of this group? Or what about this thing that's going on in the news? On the second hand, the second effect is to say the United States has a lot of problems and a lot of things that are not true. And maybe by focusing on these problems, we can see that you can't trust them, you can't trust other things, and then they can make a logical jump to you can't trust this country. Right? And it erodes trust outside the United States, even within citizens of the United States. There's other reports that were from even as far back as 1928, where troops for the first time, black troops in World War II coming back, from military times till now, but in 1928, the Soviets were looking at how can we sow discord inside this country? And again, this is a natural fault line. It was Michael Hayden who said, I'm just trying to not misquote a CIA director, right? Soviet influence campaigns, I learned that's not a good idea. Soviet influence campaigns don't create divisions on the ground. They amplify divisions on the ground, right? So look, and to that point, it's not Russian agents who were shooting black folks in their cars or on the streets of this country. It wasn't Russian agents that were responsible for the extrajudicial killings that we saw in this country in 2015 and 2016. But it's the seizing on these actual true events that are used against us. And so what actually happened, right? What we found was in 2016, something like, let me just make sure I get the exact number of, that's the data journalist in me. I don't want to get it wrong. Okay, 470 accounts on Facebook, whether they're accounts or pages, that bought 3,000 ads amounting to something like $100,000, right? To amplify all kinds of stories, all kinds of news pieces. But a very large percentage of them were targeted at African Americans, targeted at black folks, or targeted at people who would counter-protest a Black Lives Matter event, for example. And they weren't just ads. Some of these things were actually real events. There was a protest in DC and a protest in North Carolina where the person who organized it was receiving funding and support from some mysterious figures, or the people who were organizing the events and posting them ended up to being leading back to Moscow, right? There were counter-protests scheduled at the same time, basically like across the street, but organized by the exact same individual. And why would that happen is because the tech platforms allow anyone to amplify their voice, allows anyone to kind of get more tweets or get more reach. The people who see your post are not the percentage of people who follow you until you pay something. But when you're able to materialize an ad, you can further target that. You can say, I want this ad to only be seen by people who are of a particular race or self-identify as a particular gender, right? Or have a particular political viewpoint. And we all have a weakness inside of us, like that kind of string on a sweater that if you pull, it all falls apart, where our logic falls behind and our emotion takes over. There's an issue that we all have that we're basically like a single issue voter on. And by capitalizing on that issue and twisting that issue, pushing those buttons, you will respond in a way that you wouldn't think normal. You'll be manipulated, you'll be persuaded to take an action. And that's what these campaigns were designed to do, going 80 years back and going even into a few years ago. But with the technology that's available today, old strategies of misinformation and disinformation, old strategies of intelligence agencies and operatives here and abroad have a new power and a new strength, more than they ever had. A new reach that you can't stop because everyone's got these Twitter, Facebook, YouTube accounts. So on that issue, if you think about it, we're so worried about, especially as a cybersecurity expert, people hacking voting boxes. What about this ballot? What about these hanging chads? Should we have digital elections? But what we've seen in the past few years is that people have gone and hacked us, the voter, ourselves, right? Go past the box and hack the individual, and you don't need to hack the voting box. Manipulate the individual slowly, like kind of boiling a frog. I know that you're going to see this ad because I paid for it to be hyper micro targeted at you. And then I'm going to feed you this other ad. And then I'm going to feed you this other ad, and I'm going to slowly move you from, hey, I'm a dog owner, I love these things, these are my puppies, whatever, to this group kicks puppies. Oh, that's horrible, right? And then it's like, oh, this candidate actually has some animal welfare stuff on their agenda, on their platform. Oh, maybe I should look more into that, right? And then the site that you're given off to is not a site that is held by an individual that's real. Or it is a real site by a real individual who doesn't know that they're paid from outside. When you look at the targeting of black folks in this country, there were self-defense courses. It was like, oh, police violence are bad. There's self-defense courses you could attend. And there was a real, like there were in many cities across the United States, there were real events. They had real people there who were self-defense trainers, but they didn't know that the person who helped them organize the event, rented the space or paid them for the event, was a Russian operative, right? So how do we defend ourselves against this when it's so insidious and it's basically like everywhere we go? I think like that's what our conversation is going to be and what we're gonna talk more about. Another issue I want to talk about is not just Russia or not just at least in Russian Federation. It could be other parts as well. We've seen a lot of the fake ads that linked to websites or websites that were paid to just be promoted directly from a Google search were originated in what's now called Northern Macedonia, which at the time was called Macedonia. And I spent a lot of time out there doing some work for a security firm. And a lot of people were focused on this marketplace or this area or this theater because it's, a pretty, it's a free place, former Yugoslavian nation. They've got their issues, but they have like, some, democratic elections. And the people there are like relatively free. However, the people there don't make huge amounts of money. And you can find someone in a lot of Balkan countries where you're making something like $5,000 US a year. It's like a good salary. And then they found this city or town, Velez, and when they went there, that's where a lot of the IP addresses, that's where a lot of the domain registrations for these fake news websites were registered to. And people could make $2,000 US a week or a month, which is insane. So they had rooms filled of young folks generating ads and making websites, getting paid on clicks. But it required a large amount of infrastructure, technological infrastructure and financial infrastructure to even create these things. And where did that come from? Because when you meet these people, they might be hardworking and entrepreneurial, but they don't have the money for the laptop that they're using or for this room that was rented. And the city itself went from like a very small, understated village type city to one with a large nightclub. The mayor's got tons of money and a fancy car all of a sudden. And I'm not trying to connect dots that I can't connect. I'm just going to say when you follow the money, at one point you see expensive things, people who can't afford those things, and then the trail evaporates, right? It's 2019, and what we have here is an amazing space. Thanks for coming to the Glassroom. To people who are watching the stream, come down. The FOMO is real, right? The fear of missing out. So like, it's worth buying a ticket because again, there's no telling when Tactical Tech is going to do this again. It's happened in Berlin, it's happened in New York, it's happened in London, but please try to be part of this. Something else that Tactical Tech has done, not just this physical event that you're participating in and these objects you're interacting with, is Tactical Tech has produced a product or a report, right? And I always get this mixed up, so I'm just going to double check it. So it's called Personal Data Political Persuasion. I always put political persuasion first. And in it, it looks at things like this Cambridge Analytica scandal. Some people have watched on Netflix The Great Hack, I think it's called. And you're like, wow, this company and the way that they tried to manipulate things, it's wild. But Tactical Tech knew about Cambridge Analytica way before those reports. And how and why? Because we researched 300 other companies just like them. And unlike those other, unlike Cambridge Analytica, where Alexander Nix is no longer running it, and the company is appeared to dissolved, these agencies, these companies are still running. And you can see that on some of the video screens and some of the reports we have here. But I would recommend to anyone sitting in this room to download this report because it's free, it's a PDF, it's really small, and we cover each of the companies, what they say, what the tactics that are used to actually cause insurrection, tactics that are used to influence and change your perspectives in voting, and what we can do about it as voters, members of an electorate, people who run campaigns, and tech platforms. I, for one, would love to see a day where tech platforms are not allowed to take money for political ads. And it might seem really strange, but recently we've seen tech platforms do strange things. We've seen Facebook say, look, in Myanmar, we're going to cancel 300-something accounts that are run by government agencies, members of the military, et cetera, right? We've seen Twitter say, if you're a state-sponsored news agency, we're not going to allow you to even buy ads, right? And we've also seen them turn off ads from the Middle East, Northern Africa region and say these Middle Eastern news agencies are heavily connected or influenced by the governments where they are. We don't consider them able to buy these ads and push these stories. But unfortunately, there isn't something stopping that news agency from going home, opening up a laptop, and as a personal account, creating that ad and pushing it out, right? And if anyone's been paying attention, they've seen the Elizabeth Warren campaign threw an ad out and just sent that out, and it seemed like it was not vetted or judged in any way as a proof to say, like, these stopgaps are not working, right? So I would say, myself personally, and something that is mentioned in the report itself is maybe micro-targeting isn't the answer. And maybe, at the end of the day, tech firms are making money off of your manipulation and the $100,000 that was given to Facebook. It wasn't like returned, right? So it wasn't like, hey, we're sorry, we're gonna take this and give it to the people, right? So tech companies are making money on this, and maybe they shouldn't. Maybe they should say, if this is in any way political, we're either gonna not take the money at all, that's what I want, or fine, you can buy the ad, but you cannot micro-target it. You cannot say only to people who like blue suits, who wear glasses, right? Because then I would see that ad, right? Okay. So don't show me your ad, right? So wouldn't it be great if they could just say, look, I am someone who self-identifies as conservative, or I'm a MAGA person, or I'm like a Antifa person. But either way, I'm seeing all the ads. There's no targeting at all. I'm seeing an ad, like there was a real ad. It was a black woman with a gun, right? And there were real ads that were like, we have to take back this country. There were other ads that were like, and you can look them up because they were part of an Intelligence Committee report where they showed 3,000 of these banner ads, right? There are other ads where it's like, look, I'm a naturally, I was born here, I'm an American, and I'm concerned about what's going on our border. All these different areas that these ads are touching on, wouldn't it be great if they showed them to everyone and they couldn't just track your progression of radicalization? And I'll close with one other point, right? It's not just Facebook, it's not just Twitter, it's also YouTube. In Germany, where Tactical Tech is headquartered, even though our team is international, there was an event that happened in the East. in the town of Chemnitz. I'm sorry, I always say that wrong, all right? And in the east, there were basically Nazi marches, and for 2 days, people who came there to protest took over the city. The police were outnumbered. I think Angela Merkel said they were like hounding the citizens, chasing after people of color, chasing after anyone who looked like they weren't like German in their eyes. People, when heard about these stories, went to YouTube, went to social media to try to find out more, went to search engines to learn, and there wasn't information there. I used to work at the New York Times, and news gathering takes a long time. They say in journalism, you could be fast or you could be right? And so in that window where there's nothing, there's stories and videos started appearing that slowly radicalized people. So on my Twitter, which is Gemini Matt with 2 I's at the end, so GEMINIIMATT, I have links to all this stuff. The only thing I don't have a link to, which I'll put up right after this talk, is to that free PDF that you should check out from Tactical Tech. Okay, so I think I've spoken enough. Thank you so much, Renee, for being so gracious. Matt, all the time. I can't wait to hear your questions and more from you.
All right, awesome. You gave me a lot to think about. So I think I can start by maybe describing a little bit about how 2016 worked and then where we are for 2019. Because I think most people in this room probably are familiar to a large extent with the Internet Research Agency. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the work that I do now and where we've gone since then. So last week on Tuesday, so I guess October 8th, the Senate Intelligence Committee put out a report. And in that report, it cited the work of about almost 2 full years' worth of investigations that they did. So the Mueller investigation was happening in the Department of Justice, and then the Senate Intelligence Committee ran the U.S. Senate's investigation into what happened. And so in the process of doing that, they tapped a few of us to serve as outside advisors. It's called the Technical Advisory Group. And in that process, one of the reasons that they did it that way is because we were independent of the committee, and so we were provided access to the data that was turned over by the social platforms to the Senate Intelligence Committee for purposes of analyzing it. And that's because it was about 400 gigs worth of stuff from Twitter, from Facebook, from Alphabet, which was YouTube and Google Ads, and Instagram was also in there. So we had this amazing archive. One of the first times we've known for a very long time that influence operations were a challenge. And anybody who tells you that the US government was not aware of that is just it's not accurate. DARPA began programs investigating what happens, not if, but when the social media ecosystem is turned into a vast propaganda machine. And that program began in 2012. So there has always been an awareness that when you create mass consolidation of audiences, precision targeting, and a kind of perpetual, easily accessible group of people, you've basically provided a propagandist with exactly what they need, which is people who've already declared who they are. This is the interesting thing about social platforms. So much of the focus is on the fact that they created fake pages and grew their own audiences. But one of the things that we see happening now is that since people are already entrenched, already polarized, and already in Facebook groups that telegraph exactly who they are and what their affinity is, what we're starting to see now is more and more entities that are running similar propaganda operations simply going into those groups and just blasting their content out in there, both through fake accounts, fake personas, and also in the context of doing the Macedonia operation, which is doing the economically motivated content and disseminating that into highly polarized groups. So in 2016, what we saw was an operation that really started back in 2013. And it ran for a period of years. So the election was actually a very small part of a much longer influence operation. And as we've now, I'm at Stanford. That's my my day job. The work that we're doing is trying to understand and categorize about. We've seen maybe 50 or so different influence operations globally now. And so what we started to see is what are the taxonomies that we can develop to think about what these things look like writ large. So we see operations that are either extremely long-running, where they're working on developing a relationship and kind of converting people to a particular point of view or exacerbating societal divisions, and that's the kind of very long-term operation, or what you've probably seen if you've been following the story of Hong Kong right now. You might have seen that China reacted to the protests by all of a sudden throwing together a Twitter campaign. That was not a long-term, slow burn, methodical, sophisticated operation to change the hearts and minds of people in the West about the China-Hong Kong relationship. That was very much a reactive moment that responded to a particular instance that precipitated a crisis in the country, leading to a need to fill the space by kind of flooding the zone with their opinion, basically just trying to be the loudest or take up the most space. So these are two different types of operations. Some are precipitated by kind of an immediate crisis moment or a moment when everybody is paying attention, and others operate under this sort of slow burn. Another distinction that we see is the narrative propaganda versus the mimetic propaganda. And that's like a super nerdy academic way to describe it. But what it basically is stories that are laundered through the press versus stories that are put out in the form of memes. And you can do different things depending on which type of tactic you use. And so the old Soviet MO during the Civil Rights era, the Cold War, was actually to do that narrative propaganda, that laundering, where you plant a seed and you just have your various, one newspaper cites another newspaper. You repeat it until it becomes real. And in the olden days of just having press and broadcast media, that often took a long time. What we have now is that process can be done in a matter of hours because, as I'm sure you've seen, we have a news cycle to fill that's maybe, by the start, an hour after something happens, it's old news already. So what you can see is that narrative laundering process happens much faster, and because people are so flooded with content, they're not really taking the time to go and check and fact check back. So if one source plants something outrageous and then source 2 just says, as we saw so-and-so report, and then builds on it a little bit, and then as so-and-so said and builds on it a little bit more, what you start to see is the ability to really launder that narrative and take a seed and just push it all the way through until add a hashtag to it, and then it becomes the story. And nobody is going to work their way down the layers of the onion to find that initial core and then go back and look and see, did that person actually say that thing, or was that moment real? Did it really happen? So that narrative spread happens just exponentially faster than it ever could. And then the other thing is the mimetic content. And that's what social media is amazing at, because it's not just a dissemination channel, it's participatory, which means everybody is creating content. So if you need to pick something inflammatory, it's right out there. It's viral, meaning that people react emotionally and they just click the share button and that perpetuates it. And it moves with a velocity, again, as I mentioned, similar to the narrative propaganda, that's unlike anything we've seen before. The mimetic content is super interesting because you don't even have to read the article. You don't even have to spend the 2 minutes reading the article. You spend the 5 seconds ingesting the picture as you scroll through your Instagram feed and you like something and you communicate that meme was resonant for you. So you're providing instantaneous feedback in a way that you're not on the narrative front. So one thing that we saw that was really interesting when we look at how do propagandists and intelligence services run these operations is we see the more kind of old school Russian intelligence apparatus like the GRU, which is Russian military intelligence, running the narrative propaganda operation. So they had fake personas. I don't know how many of you here have heard the name Alice Donovan, but Alice Donovan did not exist, and yet Alice Donovan placed articles in over 30 different quote-unquote independent media entities, several of which had, to their credit, the conviction to reveal that they had, in fact, been entrapped by this, even though several of them also couldn't believe that it was Russian intelligence and just thought that it was like an anonymous woman who, didn't exist, but really that was probably just because she was trying to make it in the world and didn't want her identity out there. So there's layers to the degree of recognition when you find out you've been duped in this way. So there's that... The GRU was running this old school narrative propaganda operation through people like Alice Donovan, fake people like Alice Donovan, who put out their message. And then on the flip side, you had the new emergent organization, the Internet Research Agency, which is created by digital natives. It's staffed by people in their 20s. So they're not running an old school Soviet style playbook. What they're doing instead is they're going and they're creating the same kind of content that they consume. So they're creating the memes. They know that this is what's going to play on Facebook, this is what's going to play on Instagram, and they experimented. They went to Tumblr, they went to Reddit, they went to Pokemon Go at one point. They went to, Pokemon Go is interesting. They decided that, I have never played Pokemon Go, I'm too old for that, but it was...
You're missing out.
Am I? But it was like, my kid came home with like Pokemon cards, physical cards, as like a birthday party favor, and I was like, I feel like it's like Pogs all over again. But so it's Pokemon Go, and they said things like, name your Pokemon after victims of officer-involved shootings. And so it was ways to bring in the inflammatory kind of underlying, very real grievances. And everywhere they were, it was just constantly leaning into it, just designing the content for platforms that were designed to facilitate virality. If you can't even spare the 3 minutes to read Alice Donovan's propaganda, you can spend the 5 seconds and you'll see Black Matters' meme in your Instagram feed. And so it was interesting to watch those operations happened simultaneously. And then the other thing that ties the two together in some ways is we can't talk about the 2016 election without acknowledging the role of the hack and leak operation, which generated the media stories about Spirit cooking and Hillary's emails and the DNC emails and whether Bernie had, had the primary stolen from him, and the rancor, the inter-party rancor that was able to come about as a result of the GRU hacking that was then disseminated through WikiLeaks, that was then picked up by Internet Research Agency trolls and turned into numerous Twitter campaigns, Instagram memes, Facebook memes, and then real media came and amplified the entirety of that as well. So you have a framework where it's the sort of polarization and entrenchment combined with phenomenally efficient targeted propaganda, and that's the information ecosystem that we're operating in now. And so as we think about what happens in 2020, we're thinking almost less about just the Russia piece and more that this is the information ecosystem we have to work with, and what do we do given that?
Wow, powerful stuff. Are we gonna open it up to questions? Yeah, just getting a read of the room. Would anyone have a question? Not a comment, but a question? Just ruling out those fake questions. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So let's start.
I've got the mic. Isela, here you go.
I was about to scream, but not just kidding. Well, thank you. This is really interesting. So coming from Mexico, there's this narrative in Latin America that I wanted to put out there about trying to phrase it politely over here. People in the United States be blaming technology for Donald Trump, whereas a political narrative could also be just a reflection of this society. So given that we're talking about misinformation and democracy, what do you really think, and to what extent was all this misinformation campaigns and these leaks did it really make Donald Trump be elected?
Right. Did it work?
Did it work?
Did it work? And or is it just technologists boo-hooing an election, right? And I would say if you look at switching a little bit away from misinformation and talking more about the DC Leaks account or the Guccifer 2 hacks, right? These are very sophisticated cybersecurity hacks against members of the US government, going from Colin Powell to John Podesta, who's a close ally and friend of Hillary Clinton, and even with the exposure of this Comey letter about the missing email server. Most of the things that I've seen point to these as being unique and specific reasons for dismantling trust in the political apparatus. There were stories that, this is real. There's a real letter written that was like, look, Bernie Sanders shouldn't get this DNC endorsement, and we have to work against this individual in the government. And then that was leaked and exposed, which caused complete chaos in the org chart of the DNC. So did it work? Yes, it worked. Did it have an effect? I would say it was like an atom bomb going off in slow motion, right? And chaos, like, I have a lot of friends in DC, and during those times, it was like, no one was like, oh, is my email next? Is this phone call next? Like, what else is out there? I mean, you had things like Michelle Obama's passport, photos, IDs, all kinds of things, easily distributed, still on the internet, but you cannot delete them. So it's hard for us as human beings to believe that we could be so easily manipulated. I would love to believe that I'm a unique snowflake and there's no one like me out there. I'm the only one who picked up this suit from the rack, right? But sadly, not only are there others who bought this thing in other sizes, I know, it's crazy, but they probably ate the same thing I did right after buying it, because that's what someone who wears blue suits would do. And they probably tweeted a picture of themselves the same way I did, right? I would love to believe that I'm the only one who took that unique picture from the Golden Gate Bridge on Instagram, but the exact angle, exact photo is replicated tens of thousands of times. And when you think your phone is recording what you say because you cannot believe that there's a shadow profile that was better at predicting what you'll do next than you are, well, believe it. This is the state of AI. This is machine learning today. And I think that there's a kind of cognitive dissonance, but we have to get over that and look at the facts and look at the science, and then we can fight against it. So thank you. That was an amazing question, especially looking at it from an international perspective and what's going on in Mexico.
I think I would add, one of the things that I got asked about constantly, particularly doing the Senate analysis, was did it swing the election? And that was pertaining specifically to the Internet Research Agency operation, not the cumulative effect of DC leaks and everything else. Their targeting wasn't good. And that was the most interesting part of the whole thing, actually, was their messages were extraordinary. They were phenomenally resonant. Their ads had fantastic click-through rates, not an exaggeration, they did. They had, particularly the stuff targeting the Black community on Instagram, accounts that were, significantly high up into the top 10% of accounts by followers and engagements. And yet their ad targeting on Facebook was so bad. And that is the thing that I think a lot of us are still trying to reconcile, right? Which is, so I think that did it swing the election is, we tried to move away from that actually because we don't have the quantitative data. I can tell you that they ran a voter suppression campaign. I can show you the memes. I can tell you how many engagements it got. But what I can't tell you is what the people said about it. And this is the thing that still lives only within Facebook. So I could see how many reactee it had, but not which reactee. I could see that 900 people commented, but not what they said. So if you see a meme telling you stay home, don't vote, as Black people, we are going to stay home and not vote, I couldn't see what the people said back to that. And so there were these significant gaps in our understanding of impact with regard to how do you quantify the impact of propaganda. So it's kind of an ongoing research question. I don't think we're ever going to have it. We're never going to get that data from Facebook. And that's because, interestingly, now they can point to privacy concerns and say, well, after Cambridge Analytica, we certainly can't give anonymized comment data to a bunch of researchers because look at those other researchers. They were academics too. Right. So we're in this universe where nobody has the moral authority to conduct this investigation, and that's a terrible place to be, actually.
Well, there is one group, though, which is Facebook themselves, who has access to all this data and sits on top of it, right? And they do have a department there that is, they realize that not all Facebook users are the same, and some are presidents, and some run governments. And they have a whole team there that, under the name of, policy and elections, is basically Facebook's interface for all these different governments and people. And I suspect, but I've not seen anything, I didn't sign any NDAs, that they've run some tests and looked at some of how much of this are they blaming us for might be real. And I can't imagine why they wouldn't do that.
Well, we're probably never going to see it, though.
Yeah, we're never going to see that.
Hi. So we talked about a lot of different problems, and the problem space overall can be sort of overwhelming. There's problems with the population, problems with the mechanics of the platforms, problems with content that sits on top of it. Where are you trying to focus your advocacy and energy in getting ready for 2020? Is it on the ad targeting features, on the virality mechanics, on digital literacy issues or polarization?
You know, I felt like I didn't have a good answer to that until that speech you gave yesterday. Now I'm like, political ads. I have a kind of an interesting job. So my role at Stanford, I run the, I'm technical research manager is the Stanford title, for the Internet Observatory. And I actually work with Alex Stamos, who was the chief security officer when it was all kind of going down. And research takes three forms. It's proactive detection, so what kind of, it's a signals intelligence problem, right? How do you find signal indicative of manipulation? And so some of what I do focuses on that. Some of what I do focuses on forensic analysis, so I'll have a couple of reports coming out in November, first, second week, hopefully, knock on wood, looking at other adversarial actions that have taken place globally with regard to narrative propaganda in particular. I'm doing a project on election integrity in Taiwan, looking at the emergence of China as a significant actor in the space. And then the last piece of what we do is the policy recommendations. So Stanford, we did put out a gigantic white paper detailing a range of interventions. I think for me, the challenge has been, I feel like what they've done recently with this decision to say we're not going to fact check political ads in any way actually undermines a lot of the really good work that we've done with them, not we being Stanford in that case so much as we being activists, civil society, and academia, in the years since 2016, which is to say we came up, there's this remove, reduce, inform framework that they came up with, and that really was developed in conjunction with a whole lot of input from civil society, activists, and academia, in addition to the data sets, where they were able to say, I don't know how many of you have heard of remove, reduce, inform. It's their official framework, and it says when they're in the presence of organic content, if it is false or misleading, they either will remove it if it's a violation of some term of service. They will reduce its virality, basically to kind of dampen the spread, particularly for hoaxes, or they will stick an inform label above it, and that's where they'll let you know that something factually is in dispute. Here's what the fact checker had to say about it. Here's 3 different fact checkers. And Facebook itself is not running the fact checks. That's been outsourced to a consortium of vetted people, both on the right and the left, institutions that are doing the fact check. So it took them, 2 years to get there on the organic content front, to the point where we all really felt like we were starting to make some progress with having a framework, and then they just sort of, the current policy says that none of that's going to happen. So now if you're a politician, then you now have the right to disseminate falsehoods in the form of paid ads, presumably also organically. They don't want to be in the position of fact-checking political speech because they don't have the right to do that, and who wants Facebook in charge of that? The problem is, as long as we all sit here and have these conversations about who has the right, nobody is doing anything, and so now we're sort of back in this, this situation where there is no entity that has the moral authority, or the legal authority, frankly, to actually do that, and that's a significant problem. So that's where I'm going to be spending my time screaming on Twitter.
Thank you for that. Looking at solutions, I'll just quickly say, as a hacker, I don't have much faith in policy or regulations or moral or legal authorities because it's all ones and zeros. We can bend and break the rules. I have more faith in the people. So I look at it more of like a human intelligence issue. Yeah. With tactical techs, personal data, political persuasion, plug. At the end of it, if you're not going to read the whole thing, it's just like what you can do from different things, like different places. It points to a lot of this stuff that's used to harm us is like consensual, but it defaults as on. And you can opt out. You can go into the settings and say, I'm going to opt out of it. Privacy International published a whole section. They're like a UK-based kind of privacy organization on how to turn off personalized ads or ad personalization on all these different platforms. So please turn off personalized ads because it makes it harder for someone to micro-target you. So just go in, look Privacy International, ad personalization, Twitter or whatever, and then it'll explain to you step by step with screenshots how to turn that off, right? If you don't use a VPN, I would recommend it. It's a virtual private network, and it could change where you're sitting. Instead of being in San Francisco, you might be in DC. Or maybe instead of DC, you might be in Taiwan. So these ads and these materials that are being shown to you are completely misdirected anyway, but the content you want is going to be the same, right? And you also can learn more about how these data campaigns work, so you can be ready for them and understand more about it. Be an educated user or consumer, so you're less likely to line up like someone waiting for the BART. Also, on the political organizers and campaign ends, what if a campaign said, we want to publish the fact that we do not micro-target? We want to publish the fact that we are using X% of our budget on the internet, online. And we would like to see our challengers and people who are, also trying to get the same positions as us to do the same. Well, so then that could be seen as something you might vote on, like, wow, this politician is saying that they're not only not going to take strange money from strange places, they're not going to try to influence minds with trigger points, right? And we can also ask the platforms, control micro-targeting, continue these things that you forgot about. Try not to maybe take money for these ads or allow micro-targeting on these ads or reduce and remove some things from these ads. You look at what happened with WhatsApp, and people found that WhatsApp was being used to spread all kinds of misinformation, which would lead to like angry mobs, which would lead to deaths and people losing their lives, right? Especially in places like South Asia and India. And what WhatsApp eventually did, slowly, but because it was being so heavily reported, was they said, you only can forward these messages so many times, and especially if you don't know where the source came from. And it's not hard to put these controls in place, especially if we as users, as people, advocate for it, all right? So I think like that's something that we can do on the solution side.
Hi. Quick question for you, Matt, and a question for both of you. You mentioned at the beginning that at the beginning they do like a random ad and then they get more precise. How is it an issue that Russians target personal trainers? That's my first question.
Yeah.
And then question for both of you. Based on the assumption that propaganda always existed and it's always going to exist, is there an acceptable level that you will be comfortable with?
Yeah. Sure. So let me know if this sounds right. The question was, if this is always going to exist, is there an acceptable level of propaganda? And like targeting, let's say, like, self-defense instructors or personal trainers or whatever, like, how is that, like, I don't know, like good or bad thing, I think?
Is there a problem getting money from them to finance just random people doing things?
Yeah. Is it a problem them getting money for regular people to do these things? Well, the regular people who were paid, it was like super strange, right? Because they got paid in a way that it was like PayPal, through Google Sending, through Facebook Money. So again, it itself involved like a little bit of operational security and hiding and subterfuge. And I think that these individuals, these regular people, it's a common theme. Whether you're living in Velez or living in Detroit, if you're dealing with economic inequalities and the issues of those power dynamics, of course you're going to take that money to do that stuff, Of course you're going to like run a Russian drop site unbeknownst to you or create these things. I think like what we can do on the platforms is we can teach people that you might be receiving messages or funding from a strange source. This account is suspicious because it's not from your normal friend structure, or it has friends or language that's unknown to you and not your language of your fluency. There's a lot of trigger points and things that we can do on the safety of the platform side and security of the platform side to protect users. Because I see it as like protecting people side, right? It's not their fault, it's the platform's issue when it comes to safeguarding the issue. And when it comes to propaganda, I think there is no, this is me, Matt, speaking personally for Matt, there's no such thing as good propaganda, right? What got us into this mess are people using information warfare to great success on all different sides, regardless of what passport you hold. But that's a very dangerous weapon to drop. I think it's like the effects of it last generations and generations. And so those 1 and 0 bombs are probably more violent than fiery explosive bombs when you think about it. We really need controls on this. They be regulatory, but I believe in the people understanding how can I be affected? Can I own the fact that I can be manipulated? And then can I try to do things to defend myself from it?
I think on the, well, first, one of the ways that the ads worked was actually the ads were so people would like the page. They were the direction, there's always the call to action on the ad is to like the page. So once you've liked the page, you've opted into the organic content. So it's not so much just that they've served you an ad, it's that they use it as a funnel to drive you to have a recurring relationship, which is how the operation works. And then for people who were particularly receptive, high frequency commenters and things like that, they moved them into messages. They began to communicate with them one-on-one. And this is where it stops being propaganda when it becomes a human intelligence operation in which they're recruiting an unwitting asset to perform a service for them for money often. As far as the other question, though, the how do you think about propaganda, that is such a complex issue. There's been, I read old propaganda manuals, actually, from like the 1920s, because I'm fascinated by how we thought about this then, right? And there's always been like an academic distinction made between white propaganda, gray propaganda, and black propaganda. They say black, gray, white is how I think about it in my head, but black propaganda is the completely subversive stuff where you don't know where it's coming from. There's an element of inauthenticity there. The voice is fake. The newspaper doesn't exist. Alice Donovan is not a real person, right? There's a degree of subversion there that we would, I believe, consider unacceptable in a democratic society. So it's that black propaganda, that subversive propaganda that's being pushed both narratively and mimetically that we have to be thinking about addressing. But then to your point, an acceptable degree of propaganda, white propaganda is the term that's used to describe things like RT and Sputnik, right, or state-funded media operations. Depending on where you are in the political alignment or in the world, people will point to BBC, right, as this is state-funded media. How do we think about the difference? Where's that line between state-funded media? Is it propaganda? Is it not? A lot of times, the way that that you'll see that kind of classified is based on commitment to journalistic principles and integrity. And does the media outlet criticize its own government, even if the government is funding it? Is there, at least, despite the funding, still a degree of editorial independence? You will not see that from RT and Sputnik. They exist entirely to pump out their content, their point of view, their state point of view. And more than that, what we see from Russia today, in particular, and Sputnik, is they have a remarkable coincidental degree of times in which they have amplified the work of fake people, GRU hackers, and IRA trolls. Now, can I say that that is coordinated? No, of course I can't, because we have no evidence of that. Can I say that it happened? Yes, I can. Right? And so when we think about the degree of propaganda, in our media diet, there is a question around, I think you alluded to this before, what is the number one result returned for a particular topic? If you search for the white helmets in the Syrian conflict, almost exclusively you will find content produced by Russian state media because they are just flooding the zone with the idea that the white helmets are some Soros-funded imperialist conspiracy to justify war crimes and other things that are happening in Syria. And so that is where I think you start to see some really problematic things happening, where the fact that the way propaganda, which has always existed, you could go pick up this shitty newspaper at your local coffee shop. It's different when it becomes the dominant source for a particular search or hashtag, or when it is so good at gaming search engine amplification that it becomes the dominant content in the feed. RT is huge on YouTube, and if you go back and you look at their first pieces of content, go to RT, don't watch too much because it'll be all you see in your feed, but if you go there and you look, and you go back to its earliest content, they have evergreen content of the Japanese tsunami and of amusement park disasters. So what they've done to amass tens of millions of views on their YouTube content, hundreds of millions in some cases, is they have produced this evergreen disaster porn that people watch the whole way through, which communicates to YouTube's algorithm that this is somehow good content that you want to see more of. And then you watch their content evolve over time, and now all of a sudden it's just these kind of, come for the insane story about the California woman who believes in UFOs, because that stuff is there, and then the algorithm will just continue feeding it to you. So I know it's a very complex, probably unsatisfying answer.
Thank you very much for doing what you're doing. It's much needed. I have multiple questions. We've talked a lot about social platforms. I'm wondering, what are the roles of bots in these? And what are the impact of social platforms versus TV or print, if it exists?
Sure.
And my sub-question is, TV is very expensive. It made campaigning very, very expensive. Social platforms makes it very cheap. Is there a way to overspend, the negative impact that we have from micro-targeting?
The role of bots, those of you who are physically here, you can go downstairs and with 4 quarters buy 100 Instagram followers, yeah. So check out that art piece, right? That object, right? You can get likes on your favorite IG photos, right? I think it's pretty bad, and it's not hard for the platforms, as anyone who works at any of these platforms will tell you, or anyone who works on like a comment engine on a news site to tell you that, these things is a solvable problem, right? Human beings and bots, at least today, don't act the same. And there's very sophisticated bots, though, that are created by cybersecurity experts who are more like military hackers or intelligence hackers. But your average bot that's spreading information, every time you write something about Ellen, they immediately have that 2-second, and then there's a response. Those are not very sophisticated, but they still work because the role is just to hit a person who's reading that content, right? There are a lot of places that try to look at maybe not allowing all content, all comments that come in immediately to be viewable, right? There are a lot of different strategies that are used to safeguard users and platforms, and I would say, maybe we don't need all of these areas that are so easy to be attacked, right? But yeah, it's like stage 1 of this. Produce 3,000 followers and a Wikipedia page for people who can say, oh, this is a good reputation source. And that's the first thing someone might do to say, is this a good news source or not, right? And to try to create fake value and a fake reputation and then manage it using computerized systems. That's what a bot is. And then to your other question about print media versus radio versus social media, I think that print media fell behind, and that's why a lot of our favorite print sources and TV sources, they just cannot prove the return on investment of an ad. I don't know if you read that full color ad, full page that I bought in the Sunday news. I don't know whether you shared it with a friend, but I do electronically. But at the same time, the people who are running these campaigns, money is not an issue. So we still see ads that are fake running on actual real news sites, right? Or materials that have malware in them running on real news sites being hyper-targeted at individuals. So I think financially there's no amount that costs too much. If Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube said all these ads are going to cost 3,000 times more what they do, they still would be purchased because the source is a government that has millions and millions of dollars, and it's a great return on investment using electronic means. I would probably rather see print ads because it's harder to micro-target there, right?
I think I was looking at this today after a debate about the Zuckerberg thing that was happening on Twitter. So I actually went and pulled the stats. Turns out for 2020, the expectation is still that broadcast media will be the greatest amount of spend. I believe the reason for that is primarily the demographic. So if you're looking to target older people are more likely to vote, older people watch TV, push it out on TV. So that's still where the spend is projected to be for 2020. Again, the pie is shifting, particularly smaller races, less resourced candidates do go more digital first. People who want to reach a younger audience, particularly in a primary, more digital first. You may have noticed a lot of the, particularly right now, the Democratic primary, so much of the fundraising is happening online. And so a lot of the ads are on Twitter and on Facebook and elsewhere just to get people who are going to participate in that small dollar donation process. Again, you don't have the targeting. That's the thing. I mean, Facebook is a remarkable tool for growing an audience. And if you produce exciting, powerful content, your cost to acquire drops, right? And so if you have that talent, that capability, you should, I think, be spending more money on the digital side. And I think we're going to continue to see that shift.
Yeah, great question, though. There's two people. One hand back there, one hat over here.
I haven't been to this side. I promised this gentleman the next question, and then I'll get back to you.
I'll be quick. There's a lot of talk about Facebook, obviously, and I'm just wondering, is the danger or the influence pretty well spread out among multiple networks? I mean, we talk about Twitter, we talk about YouTube, talk about Instagram. I don't know if you could rank them and how powerful they are, but can you give any kind of sense of, like, you know, if you had one bullet, which one? Well, don't want to use that analogy.
Had one flower.
If you had one flower,
Yeah.
which one would you hit over the head with?
Like in The Bachelor.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, that's an interesting question. You know, in 2016, Instagram was actually the greatest ROI for them, which is a thing that almost nobody talks about. And if you watched any of the tech hearings, like I watched them all, Google constantly forgot it owned YouTube, and Facebook constantly forgot that it owned Instagram. And so I remember the first hearing Google sitting there, the GC from Google being like, well, we're not a social network, but these guys. And so it was interesting. I think one of the first ways I've tried to frame this for the senators actually who were doing that questioning was to say you have to think of this almost as like an assembly line. This is an ecosystem problem. You can't actually pick one, right? I think if you absolutely had to, I would probably still go with Facebook, and that's because it has the ads, the amplification, the groups. The groups are a huge vulnerability. I participated in research that led to a cluster takedown. I think that was last week, maybe a week and a half ago. A collection of Blue Lives Matter pages operated out of Kosovo. Now, the thing that was so interesting about that is, one, they weren't hard to find, right? But more importantly, the pages had, some of the bigger ones had over 100,000 followers. This was related, actually, I found it while working on a Ukrainian network that a reporter had found, and those pages had upwards of 300,000 up to about 1.1 million, and they hadn't bought a single ad. They used fake engagement to, make it look like they had a lot of followers, which they bought. Then they went and they used fake accounts and they joined groups and they pushed stuff into groups. They were not on any other platform. They were Facebook only. And so if you want that kind of like one-stop shop, with YouTube, YouTube is like a content host. It happens to have its own virality engine, its own promotional engine, but usually in order to drive attention to YouTube, there's some blast, some sharing it across what we call the ones that help you, like, we go through like coordination where you operate in a closed messaging environment, then you create your content that happens on Imgur or YouTube, where it also serves as host, also serves as amplification tool. Then you run your campaign, and that's where you take your YouTube link and you put it out on Twitter and Facebook and elsewhere. But it's kind of still, unless you really like hit that magic moment and trigger YouTube's recommendation engine and wind up on a front page or in a playlist off of somebody significant, it's harder to execute. So just in terms of like influence and persuasion, Facebook still offers the best kind of, one-stop shop.
Yeah, and for me, I would say, as a security researcher, it's the areas where people run to. It's the platforms that are behind the big known platforms that I'm most concerned about because it's so hard to do research there. I'm talking about things like Discord or 8chan or 4chan or whatever, or that not Twitter, run your own server one, which I'm totally forgetting. Mastodon, yeah. So Mastodon. It's so hard for us to figure out what's going on there. So after your account is banned or blocked, you could find a complete community inside one of these places, and it's really hard to like sock puppet your way in, build fake trust, and dismantle a community when they're like 3 sites down and really small. And I think it might be easier for us to start in some of these places where they don't have like very sophisticated ad targeting as a place, but so I think it's maybe a little bit of both, right?
I want to make sure I get an equal number of men and women asking questions. Are there women in the audience with questions? Okay. Oh, did you have one? Okay, we'll go here.
So my question is, I think I'm mentally grouping kind of what you all are discussing into 2 groups. So there's one where the influence operation is clearly fake, right? Like the information is just false. And then there's the other one that you all mentioned where it's they use truth, but they use it to polarize and to sow division and discord. And so I think the first one is obviously easier. Like everyone can agree, like, oh, this is a falsehood. Like, we should prevent it. We should stop it. Where do you draw the line when it comes to using actual events, using truths, but to manipulate, right? And I think currently you can say, oh, this is a Russian campaign to capitalize on BLM or like other things, and we should stop that because that's a foreign kind of force. But what if that moves domestically, and let's say there's anarchists or whoever else who may just decide to use real events to provoke emotions and to sow discord or chaos or things like that. Like, how do you draw the line there, and what are some good ways to combat that?
I think you really can't in this country, right? And that's the interesting thing. That's the big debate we're having right now after like Mark Zuckerberg's speech yesterday too. What do you do when it's real? When it is just freedom of expression? And the ways that we've found to deal with disinformation, to think about it, one of the things we look at, so per your point, actually, if you go back in history, the best propaganda has some degree of truth to it, per the point about look how badly they treat black people in America, being blasted out to India and elsewhere. It was true, and they used it. And so there is that, when I talk about what's your definition for propaganda, I usually say information with an agenda. It doesn't mean it's not true or false. It can be either, in fact. It's just that it's information inflected for a particular point of view. With the remove, reduce, inform, but I think that framework's actually good. But we look at things like authenticity, right? And I think Zuckerberg alluded to this in his speech yesterday too. Is the account authentic? Is the page authentic? You get down in some weird rabbit holes, right? Which is like, what does it mean to be an authentic Texas secessionist? Where is that line? If you're Russian, we can say no. If you're New Yorker, are you an authentic Texas secessionist? Do you have to be physically in Texas? What if you're an expat? What if you move to New York or something, right? And so you do wind. This is the challenge of content moderation, and that is in fact the problem. Which is once you get down in the weeds, there are no easy answers, which is why I think a lot of the temptation is to say this is too hard for us to figure out, let's just not do anything. I wrote an article where I was kind of joking around, but I was like, have bots ruined clicktivism? And that was because we saw this weird thing happen where like Twitter allowed Ted Cruz to run an ad campaign during his race with Beto O'Rourke last year, the Senate race. Where they gave him an ad type, and you have to be privileged to have this access to this ad type. It's not available to the general population. And when people click the ad, it auto-generates a tweet that comes from you that is verbatim what the ad says. So let's say it's like, go Ted Cruz, right? Or Ted Cruz is awesome or whatever. And so if I click that ad, I am now saying with my Twitter account, with no indication, no tie back to the ad or the visual, go Ted Cruz is awesome. So all of a sudden, during the debate, there would be these like litanies of verbatim tweets talking about how awesome Ted Cruz was. And so my first thought is like, oh, it's like a botnet, I didn't realize it was like a giant self-owned by Twitter that had actually, in fact, created the tool to allow real people to look like bots because it's that much harder to, take the extra 10 seconds to type in go Ted Cruz yourself. So there's ways that we're thinking about this, like, authenticity, dissemination, does it look spammy? Even if the spammer is domestic, there's certain beliefs that we have as a society now about spam and where that line is around the kind of content we expect, we welcome into our feed versus the kind of content we don't want to see. But ultimately, when it gets right down to it, this is why they don't want to be in the position of policing political ads or policing political speech, because at some point, there is some group that is in fact real that holds that position, and that's where we see things going, actually, just amplifying the real division. And so this leads to really important questions that we have to have as a society about how we feel about that and where we think those lines should be.
And I would just quickly say there's a piece downstairs, Ad Watch, that Manuel and Yana worked on, and you can take a look at that downstairs, and it shows you how you can search on the particularly Facebook ads, what's being advertised, but to who, from where, And you don't need to imagine a hypothetical when it comes to these domestic issues coming from a domestic source. If you look at radicalization, alt-right, neo-Nazis inside the United States, and this new wave of terrorism that's domestic, these entities and properties, whether you're looking at different racial justice organizations who monitor them, they can just point them out to you, right? That says, like, look, this group is buying all these ads. They're creating like a radicalization pipeline. People are seeing things that are true. But for me, the issue is when it's done technologically, you're being targeted. You're not seeing, like, this content is being delivered personally to you in a way that's going to move you through this rabbit hole. And the first top of the hour, you felt one way, and then 2 days later, you feel a completely different way. It's very dangerous, right? And that's not how you might pick up a newspaper, walk down the street, you throw your coins in a paper cup, you grab the paper that you want to read, you read the article you want to read at the pace you want to read it. You're not actually transmitting through the scrolling speed information about yourself, like, oh, I'm this reading level, therefore I might have attended this particular kind of school, and I can be targeted in this particular way. And there's not that ability to take so much from you. And so I think, like, for me, it's more about safeguarding against those things that are hidden into electronic platforms.
So I'm afraid we do have to wrap up there, but I wanted to thank all of you for your amazing questions, and also thank Matt and Renee for their amazing answers and contributions and research and all the important work you're doing, especially before this coming election. I'm sorry we have to end on that dystopian note.
Yeah.
But this room and this discussion does give me hope, so thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.